Well, good afternoon to those of you here in the chapel, as well as those of you on Zoom, and perhaps those who might be listening later on. Today, we are transitioning to one of the greatest leaders in biblical history. We're going to be talking about Nehemiah, and we're going to be talking about the law of navigation this week, and I'll take some time to explain that. The book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament is just a compelling story of leadership. And so you'll want to read the background passages that we will get to in just a minute, because it will really enrich your life and ministry. So again, our foundational chapters in the book of Nehemiah for this week, chapter 1, first 11 verses, then chapter 2, 1 through 20, then Nehemiah chapter 4, 1 through 23, and then Nehemiah 6, 15 through 16. So those are our foundational chapters in the book of Nehemiah that supply our background material in the Bible for this week's study. So let's take a little bit of time and do a little introduction on this law of navigation. In a nutshell, the law of navigation states that anyone can steer the ship, but it takes a leader to chart the course. Leaders who navigate do even more than control the direction in which they and their people travel. They see the whole trip in their mind before they even leave the dock. They have a vision for their destination. They understand what it will take to get there. They know who they'll need on the team to be successful, and they recognize the obstacles long before they appear on the horizon. And then finally, the secret to the law of navigation is being prepared. And that's taken from our book that we're using, The 21 Most Powerful Minutes in a Leader's Day, on page 49. So as we consider our time today, here's our leadership thought. Leaders not only know where they are going, they also know how to get there. If you were in a car with someone and you knew that they were going to Cincinnati from Chillicothe, you would probably be a little more confident if you were confident that they knew how to get there, not just that they were planning on going to Cincinnati. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. You have to know where you want to end up, but you also have to know how to get from point A to point B. That's our thought for today. So we're going to dive into the story of Nehemiah by way of introduction. Jerusalem's walls at the time of Nehemiah had been destroyed by the Babylonians 120 years ago. And yet, all that time, there were still people in Jerusalem, and no one amongst the remaining residents did anything about it. So there the walls were broken down, which of course made the residents quite vulnerable to attack. But perhaps even more significant than that, the people were ridiculed because they had defenseless walls that were destroyed. But even beyond that, God's reputation was tarnished because the walls of the city were broken down. And so we start in the book of Nehemiah, and Nehemiah, who now is in Persia, so hundreds of miles to the east, he hears about the situation in Jerusalem when some countrymen, one of whom may well have been his brother, come and give him a report. And so when he hears about the situation, the walls being broken down, the people in distress and very discouraged and unmotivated, and the sense of God's reputation being reduced, it breaks his heart. In fact, the text in chapter 1 of Nehemiah says that immediately upon hearing that news, Nehemiah went about weeping, fasting, mourning, and then praying over the situation. And Nehemiah had a very interesting job, by the way. He was the cupbearer to the king. Now, in those days, that was a very, very important job because the cupbearer didn't just bring the wine to the king, but the cupbearer had to taste it first to make sure it wasn't poisoned. So if someone was going to die from that experience, it wasn't going to be the king. So that was Nehemiah's job. He was the cupbearer. So he determined, after hearing this report and this report breaking his heart, something had to be done about it, that he could no longer let the situation go unaddressed. So, what about a navigator? Nehemiah could see, and by see, I kind of use that word in quotation marks because we really might use the word envision, both a problem and a solution. Don't you love people like that? Not just people who only see problems, but people who also see solutions. Even though it appears that Nehemiah had never been to Jerusalem before, that he had lived his whole life in Persia, yet he hears this report and immediately begins to see in his mind, to envision the solution to the problem. Because here is what a leader, or a navigator especially, sees, envisions. A leader or navigator sees farther than others see. A leader sees more than others see. And then finally, a navigator or a leader sees before others sees. So let's unpack each of these this afternoon. Although Nehemiah was hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem, nevertheless, he could see or envision both the problem and the solution to it. In other words, he mentally created the solution first before he began to implement it. And we hear about that principle a lot, the sense that you create it in your mind, and then when you replicate it in real, it's really the recreation of what you've already put in your mind. So he created this mental solution first, from far away. Secondly, he saw more than others see. Nehemiah knew that the wall could remain as it was. It could not remain as it was. It had to be rebuilt. But he also knew what would be necessary in terms of materials, and he made a plan to secure the needed items. He also sought to secure safe passage for himself to get to Jerusalem. So this is after he sought the king, and the king says, "What do you need?" And so Nehemiah was ready for that question. And he had already thought it through in advance. And so he made provision for all of these things, and for the people, for the letters to get authority from the neighbors nearby. All of that stuff he foresaw before he ever left. And it made the trip to Jerusalem that much more productive, that much safer, that much faster, because he had everything that he needed. Talking about seeing before others see, Nehemiah could see that there would be opposition from neighbors to rebuilding the wall. Doesn't it seem like anything worthwhile, there's almost always someone to oppose it? There's always the so-called negative Nellies out there who are trying to tell you why something can't be done, why it will never work, why we've never done it before, that it's just going to fail. There's always those kind of people. Nehemiah saw that before he encountered that. He allowed for that. So he anticipated this opposition, and he got it. He anticipated the potential danger and planned accordingly. This helped him to resist the intimidation that these neighbors tried to impose on Nehemiah and the workers. He eventually he created a brilliant plan to both defend the workers and to keep the rebuilding project on schedule. You go into to the book, and you find that the project was finished in 52 days, less than 2 months, and they're just brilliance in how he orchestrated that, and we'll get into that as the week unfolds. But you just see Nehemiah figuring everything out in advance, having a plan to deal with the contingencies, and when you get to the end of the story, you just stand back in amazement at how he saw it first mentally, then created it in actuality, and how he gained all the resources that he needed in order to get the job done. So, as I said, the people needed only 52 days, less than 2 months, to rebuild the wall. Now remember how long the wall had stayed dormant, basically 120 years. And so here comes this guy, Nehemiah, who's able to, with obviously the help of the people, in less than 2 months, he reverses 120 years of inactivity. So the thing had been in ruins for 120 years. They were about to do it because they had a great leader to navigate for them. That's what made all the difference in this case, is that they had a leader to take them from beginning to the end. Nehemiah knew his purpose. He made his plans and led the people through the process. His is truly one of the most remarkable stories of leadership that's ever been recorded, Scripture or even outside of Scripture. So, I like this question for the day. I like them all, but this one I like especially. It says, do you plan to take the trip, or are you content just to take it? In other words, do you plan it, or do you just go for it? And so perhaps after today's lesson, it would be good to make a little plan before our trip, and things will go much better. We appreciate you being here as always. We'll get into, for the rest of the week, just some great things as we'll take a deeper dive into the story of Nehemiah. I encourage you, if you haven't already, to pull those scriptures out and take a look at them. They will really help to frame the story and to augment what we covered here in our brief time today. So thank you, as always, for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you right back here tomorrow. God bless you. Have a wonderful rest of the day.